I brought up the fact that the regulators came out and said, well, all the major US regulators came out and said, it's okay to use innovative technology, including artificial intelligence. But they didn't say, we won't go after you if something bad emerges out of it. So what's your take on that? Are they going to lighten up? Or what do you think is going to happen with the regulators' attitude?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, the regulators' job is, obviously, they have missions in terms of financial stability, customer protection, making sure that the safety and soundness of financial institutions, and they have a number of different missions. So, they are going to pursue those missions regardless. But, to the first part of the question, I think regulators are, trying very hard to wrap their arms around the new technologies like AI. And there's really two perspectives on it. One of them is the utilization of these technologies by the firms that they regulate and the industries that they regulate, the banks and others, and then they're also very attuned to, many of the financial institutions use third-party vendors and even, fourth-party vendors who are vendors to those vendors. So they're kind of on top of that ecosystem. There's also utilization of AI and other technologies by the regulators themselves, and Penny kind of alluded to that, whether it's for detection of financial crime or, market surveillance. At the CFTC, where I worked and was responsible for leading a staff working group that started monitoring fintech and blockchain and virtual currency developments, and then we launched about 2 years ago in kind of mid-2017 Lab CFTC, which was the CFTC's innovation hub. These represent actual concerted efforts by the regulators to understand the regulations, to have points of contact around innovation, and to have a real two-way street around these things. So they're announcing programs, they're dedicating resources, they're putting structure around it, and like the announcement that Penny alluded to about sort of using digital tools for AML KYC, they're trying to make the public understand it's okay to experiment with them, but the expectation is going to be that it's risk-based and proportionate. I'm going to mention one other thing that I think is relevant to this, which was on February 11th, there was an executive order from the president about AI, and it directs. I brought a copy of it here. Someone can have it after the program if they want. But it actually directs federal agencies to do sort of a stock take to figure out what their capabilities are, what data they have, what algorithms they're using to adopt programs. And I know from a recent visit to Washington about a week after this came out, some of my former colleagues are actively thinking, how can we implement and execute this order? And there are, specific timeframes within which they're supposed to develop programs that we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later. In the program, it directs NIST to develop standards around AI, which I think is very important. So I think we're seeing a lot of activity and commitment and resource that will help promote this evolution.
So banks don't need to have, what about those specific fears of having too few suspicious activity reports, or of uncovering something that was sort of under the surface before?
Yeah, I think these things don't change overnight. And I think also, as firms start to develop or evolve their compliance programs, so for example, if there's a greater reliance on automated processes and less on manual, I think there's a general understanding that the process of getting suspicious activity reports that are on PDFs and faxed, and people are sorting through these things manually, is not an efficient way to detect financial crime and to process this information. But you still have to show that you're doing something better, and that if in adopting the new technologies and the new methodologies, that you're not missing out. And does that have to be 100%? I think that's to be determined. But I think you need to show you have kind of processes and safeguards around it. but they're definitely listening.
All right. Well, let's. Oh, did you want to comment on that too?
Sure.
Yeah.
I just want to add on. So I think one point or a couple of points I'll make, right? So I think one is the regulators have very much grown up in the rules-driven world, and they really understand the rules, which are well documented. And when something is flagged as suspicious, they know why exactly it's been flagged as suspicious. I think we had a couple of years in between where the AI-driven models were more like black box, right? So they would flag something as suspicious or flag something as a false positive, but then how do you prove that it is a true false positive, right? So I think one thing to keep in mind is the proof or the burden of providing the proof still rests with the banks and still rests with the software vendors who are operating in this space. So what we are starting to see now is a lot of investment in explainable AI, where you can actually explain what the recommendation provided by the AI model, how did it come about, and what are the variables that actually impacted it, right? And I think you also need to prove that you are doing or you are providing outputs or false positives, which is at least as good as the rules-driven systems, right? So I would say that at least for another year or so, you would see the AI-driven systems as being very much complementary to the rules-driven systems. And then once there is a confidence established, they're at least at par, if not better, right, with the rules-driven systems. That's when you're going to start seeing people start to swap out the applications.
So Bradford, you earlier described how brutal and painful and slow all of this work is. What's the positive side? What are some of the wins that are happening, and how is this starting to help the banks and eventually help all of us in stamping out crime?
There's a positive side? No, I'm just kidding. No. Yeah, so I think the mission here is really powerful, and it's very important because with these businesses that are like, let's say, 2 or 3 degrees removed from their mission, it can be very easy to lose sight of this, right? But in the end of the day, like take the BNP Paribas story, right, which we all know is a $9 billion fine, right, which is the top line number that we see in the news. But the reason it's a $9 billion fine is because they sponsored genocide. Like they financed genocide. Like this is really, really horrible. And if you really study the story, I've actually started to work on an essay about it because of the issue I'm going to talk about in a second. You see, wow, this was really bad, and the behavior of the executives at BNP Paribas was really unexcusable. Like they should have shut the bank down. It's like disgusting, absolutely wretched. And stopping this kind of stuff is super important and impactful in the world, right? So the mission around what financial crime compliance is trying to do, the behavior that it's stopping, is really important, right? This isn't stealing like fraudsters are stealing, right? It's a very vanilla, transactional, like financial game, right? These people already have the money, right? And they've gotten it by dubious means, and they're using it for even more dubious means. So this is really bad stuff. So the mission is great, and the impact that you want to keep connected to that positive impact that we have and that mission that we have. But it's very easy to get distracted by it because, in the end, it's like you're dealing with bankers and they seem very transactional, right? And then you're dealing with all these rollout issues, and then that is very frustrating, and you're sort of like multiple degrees removed from the actual like mission and impact that you originally kind of thought about. So I think that's a problem for all of us in the space, is like, how do we constantly remind ourselves of our positive mission and impact as we get bogged down in these day-to-day details, which make us lose sight of that. So I think the important work here is extremely like valuable to society. And it's part of this world where the nation-state actors like reach through industry in order to conduct their activities. And it's happened in finance. Like, for example, we're in a mode of financial warfare, right? Like nation states use sanctions for financial warfare, actually. It's written about, like there's books about this, right? So it's actually a political and warfare strategy. So it's not only about catching these bad actors and whatnot, but actually the governments around the world are implementing this as a core part of their statecraft. So you basically are engaged in this world where the financial institutions play a pivotal role in geopolitics and also in crime fighting activity. So these are really powerful, very important things, but it's easy to get distracted from the mission, I think, because there's just so much stuff to distract you.
The long haul. Can any of you think of any specific examples where an AI system has actually caught a bad activity?
I can tell you about some, but I can't share them, right? But like, yeah, I mean, absolutely, you see bad people that folks aren't catching in banks all the time. I think you just need to think about, what are the kinds of failures that are going to let risk through, right? So like an easy example that we see in media screening is that is like false matches on names or inability to match a name, right? So if you have a different permutation of a name, and then the name is only referred to later by the surname or something else, then you're just going to utterly miss the article. If you have a long tail scenario where you have a bad actor and it's not a famous person, right? Then you could easily just onboard this bad actor now. So I think there's clear cases, in particular with what I would call the beefy problems in financial crime compliance. And these are the two big dogs here are the transaction monitoring system and then the adverse media screening, right? So the rest of the stuff is largely like simpler, like list matching type problems and stuff like this. It's not nearly as easy to let really bad stuff through, right? So it's much easier to, and of course these systems generate tons of false positives, but it's the bad stuff is going to tend to be in there more, right? The difficulty of catching bad stuff in a problem like negative media screening or like transaction monitoring is a far larger degree of difficulty. So I think that this is where you see a lot of bad stuff come through. And I think, like to your point, this is actually a great question. If you do like a look back, right, using modern technology, if you did a look back for EDD, using media screening and other tech, and then you did a look back for monitoring, again using monitoring tech, you're definitely going to find a lot of bad stuff. Of course, in a bank the size of JP Morgan Chase or Morgan Stanley or something, you're going to find loads of bad stuff. So I think this is a great question, right? So like, okay, what if we did that? Do the regulators get to go after those guys? Because I can tell you for sure, from a modeling perspective, there's loads of bad stuff, and we'll definitely find it if we did a look back. So I don't know.
I mean, I think, outside of traditional financial crime, an area where also there are kind of concrete, well-publicized examples are around kind of cryptocurrencies where there's a visible, transparent ledger on the blockchain. And so there was an exchange or a trading platform in Japan that got hacked a number of years ago called Mt. Gox. And hundreds of thousands of bitcoins, which at the time were worth $200 to $400, and now even in crypto winter are worth $4,000. But so hundreds of thousands of them were recovered, and it took multiple years. But the investigators were able to follow kind of the trail and then see kind of network patterns and dynamics. The advantage in that particular area is because there's visible ledgers, but then there's also techniques, but then people do network analysis and so on. And so they actually recovered hundreds of thousands of these. They captured the alleged culprit or culprits or ring of culprits, and they've actually, people who thought they had lost all their money years ago are now getting paid off. So, there are, some of these techniques, I think, that have been developed in the context of financial crime are now starting to be applied even in, kind of frontier areas like blockchain and cryptocurrency transactions.
So, Brad, and maybe and Arvind too, can you tell us just to explain a little bit what AI can do that these existing systems that are out there can't?
Yep. And so I'm just going to piggyback on the last question, right? And I'll give you some examples. So I think, and Bradford mentioned about entity matching, right, and entity resolution. And, firms have been at it for so long. I think they have, by and large figured it out. And, if you have similar sounding names or, names which are, spelled slightly differently, there are systems out there today which can actually resolve that. And I don't think that is the true value of AI. I think, the true value really comes in kind of matching different sorts of things, right? So, for example, you could start matching behaviors. So, you could be onboarded today as, Rhythm, and tomorrow you will get onboarded as Jack because you got banned, as a Rhythm. But then the system should be able to match the payment patterns or the behavioral patterns and say, hey, this looks familiar. And, we flagged it last time, so let's dig a little deeper on this entity that we just onboarded and look at who is the ultimate, beneficiary of this account, right? And then you figure out, hey, it's the same bad actor, right? So that's one example where, AI can be very effective. I think the second thing, right, which I think most people are not doing today, is you do a ton of validation when you're doing the CDD and the EDD, right? But you're not doing anything to really make sure that people are complying with those agreements when they were onboarded. Okay, so you submit a bunch of documentation, you submit a bunch of, you sign a bunch of documentation and say that this is what I'm going to do, these are the accounts that I'm going to deal with at the time of onboarding to get through the door. But who is actually making sure that you're constantly compliant with that, right? And if your legal stature is changing, who is going back and actually updating those things? So that's where, again, AI can be much more effective than traditional technologies.
I think, like I said, that the more, I agree with the point, the more complex the problem and the things that you're trying to match or identify, then the greater the lift that you'll see from machine learning, right? For example, this entity match problem, right? Yeah, people have worked on it for a very long time. There's lots of these fuzzy matching engines out there and stuff. And so the results are reasonable. The AI adds value when you start to do things like, okay, I've got a common name, I've got John Smith, right? But this John Smith, we know where they're from, we know their age and stuff, and so there's lots of other things I could look at in a media article that tell me if this is the same John Smith or not. So you start to go from an entity match to an identity match, and it starts to become interesting for machine learning to weed out the false positives of these common names. But this is a trivial example. The really interesting ones are, like you said, like media, right? Where it's like, okay, it's a name match, but then it's also a topic match and it's also a relation, right? So this is the person, this is the bad thing, the person has done the bad thing, or they've been convicted of the bad thing. And this is where it gets complex. In Brazil, if you've been accused of anything bad, then you're probably just rich. Everybody rich has been accused of bad stuff in Brazil. So if you talk to a private bank and there's onboarding citizens in Brazil, then their risk appetite usually includes anybody who's been accused of anything, right? Because it's irrelevant. In the U.S., you don't get accused of fraud very often unless you're up to some bad stuff, right? They're not trivially going around and accusing people of fraud in the press. In Brazil, that's not the case. It's actually fairly normal. But actually, there's this notion of how far the allegation has progressed. If you've been convicted of fraud, indeed, this is quite bad, even in Brazil, right? So you need to understand these nuance, and this is, again, sort of more of a machine learning problem where you've got an entity over here, you've got a topic of bad stuff over here that you can identify in the text, and I can see semantically how they're linked, and I can tell you, this is an article you want to review. This is probably the person, this is definitely really bad stuff, and I'm almost certain that this person has been actually convicted of this bad stuff. So this becomes now something that really is way outside the bands of my risk tolerance, and I want to look at this article first. And I think, again, you see this kind of stuff with transaction monitoring where, to your point, very complex patterns that you're trying to match. Right, and the FFIC red flag rules and all these other red flags rules all over the world are very trivial. It's a separate code, a separate discussion about why these should be code and not these fuzzy things that they are now. But ultimately, these generate massive amounts of alerts, right? And the way to kind of escalate the ones that really need the human eyes on is really a complex problem, right? Like you can resolve some of the really trivial, silly ones, like this is like a systematic wire that happens like every month, right? This should just be suppressed. Like we know this client. This isn't a matter of them doing their business. Versus something that's very complicated that involves network analysis, and I need to link in the person's identity and see stuff about their risk profile and follow the participants in the transaction graph and see, this is a transaction with this other sub, and if I look up at the parent company of the sub, now I see that there's a beneficial owner of this who looks sketch and has committed some transactions in the past with this other entity that we found that is definitely like associated with unbankable individuals. So this is what you see when you go into like the layer, right, of the hardcore financial crime investigation folks, and you go into their layer and they have the maps up and pins and they're following stuff all around, right? This is the machine version of that, right? Like let's take them straight to the risk and just show them, directly, like, here's the risk, right? You don't have to go build all these maps and stuff. Like, we've done that for you. Just investigate it here. So I think this is where the hugest wins are, and the other stuff are, like, much simpler. But, adverse media screening and enhanced due diligence, and I think the transaction monitoring side is where we'll see, like, huge industry-changing, like, blockbuster wins.
I thought it was interesting that you brought up everybody in Brazil who's rich could be considered a fraudster, because one thing I always wonder is, if you're just looking at patterns, could an innocent person have a pattern that looks like a suspicious person? Maybe I go to Pakistan a lot. Maybe I have a cousin who's in ISIS. Or could there be a danger of looking for these connections and then finding something that's not.
Yeah. Oh, my poor Pakistani brothers and sisters, man. It's like everybody will pop on right? It's like you. It's like, because they all have very similar names, right? So it's really tough. I think that, there's serious issues with this. I don't think it's going to lead to like a lot of these weird, like, false, attacks on people or whatever. I'm much more worried that it's just creates massive amounts of noise and work for people, right? And especially around these, like, some of these common names in certain languages, it's hugely problematic. But in terms of like AI identifying like a pattern, and then people are going after folks and so on, I don't think this is going to happen. I think that this is overblown. I think in China this stuff's going to happen because they brazenly don't care about human rights, and they do like this surveillance state stuff. So there's definitely going to be some nasty crackdowns that we'll see in China. There'll be a lot of good stuff, like good doctors already using AI to do diagnosis for patients at scale of 200 million patients, right? So Ping An is doing stuff that will blow everyone's mind. If you haven't paid attention to them, you definitely should. But on the other side, like there's going to be all these AI models that are triggering a lot of these really, unfortunate actions. In the US, I don't think this will happen very much. And I think the big reason why is that AI is not about automating everything. It's about levering up the humans, right? So we'll surface the stuff and we will make these mistakes, but I think the humans will correct it. I think where there's no human in the loop to correct it and people try to naively push for full automation, this is where you're going to see some really disastrous results like the worry that you're proposing.
Just to add a little bit on that, I think the other trend that we're seeing right now is the probability of bias in AI, right? Because the historical data that is being used by the machine learning models is probably biased, yes. Okay, and is biased on a number of factors like age and sex and race and so on and so forth. So we are actually doing some work on looking at models and looking at the outcome of the models and detecting if there are biases within the models, right? And we can tell, hey, check for sex. Is there bias based on sex in this model? And it's going to give you a number, spit out a number and say that there's a 4% bias, right? And then there are different methodologies that we're using to kind of validate those models and check those models for bias. And I think this is going to become something which is more commonplace, and I think regulators are also going to start asking for those kind of proof points in addition to having like explainable AI.
And maybe,
Yeah.
maybe just to stay on you for a minute, so isn't data a part of that too? Because it's, it seems like with a lot of the famous examples of like facial recognition not working properly, it's because you've got a smaller data set of people in this race and the majority, a much bigger data set of people in that, that race, and then your model is just going to be much more effective for the people in the majority. From your perspective, how do you solve for that you're going to have, minority groups, or you're going to have splinter groups of people that you don't have as much information about?
No, I think that's the holy grail, right? And I think what banks and everybody is trying to do is really create like more apps where you create that immersive experience, right? And a bank is no longer a bank, but it is also your financial advisor, and it's also helping you book hotels and book your travel and so on. The idea behind all of it is to really collect as much interaction data as you can, right? Because the more data you have, your models are going to be better, right? So that's kind of one part of it. The second part of it, and I know Bradford mentioned earlier that banks are not quite there in coming to terms with the adoption of these models, right? And that problem is because of the legacy, right? The burden of legacy that these guys carry is humongous, right? So I was talking earlier about a bank that we are working with have 20,000 Teradata stores, right? So how do you figure out what is your right source of data? Because as you mentioned, garbage in, garbage out, right? What is your single source of customer? Every bank that is represented here, I can guarantee you have at least 12 customer masters at a minimum that you know of, right? And there are probably 30 others that you don't even know of, right? So which one do you select, right? And which one do you pick from? So that's kind of another challenge, right? So really having to solve kind of the data quality problem, and interestingly enough, AI is also helping solve data quality problems. It's very similar kind of concept, right? You're moving from a rules-driven world. How many rules can you write, right? To move to AI to detect data quality problems and start fixing those data quality problems. So AI is actually going to even help rescue you from that the data problem, if you will,
All right.
right?
So let's go back to Bradford, and then we'll go back to the regulatory side. So you started to bring up how AI changes the way people work, and you said there needs to be a human in the loop in every case, which I thought was interesting, because a lot of people think of AI as killing jobs. How do you see AI changing the nature of work in this area specifically, and or in general?
Yeah, I think a lot of people say a lot of stuff about AI that haven't been building systems for 20 years, so they're learning the stuff the hard way now, whereas I already have several of these battle scars from these naive moments in my earlier career. So I think, listen, this stuff's really hard, especially for complex problems like we're dealing with here in financial crime compliance or many of the other kinds of problems that I've seen and worked on over the years. So it's like if you're serving an ad, or you're doing an Amazon recommendation, or you're doing like a retargeter, right? I mean, we've all, you buy a toaster and you can't get away from the toaster, right? Online, you go, look this way, there's a toaster, look this. We don't know. I just had a discussion with some of my team in Europe, and somebody was talking about fixing this toaster problem. We had this very interesting pub discussion about it, which got quite lively. And I brought up the point that perhaps actually that if you've bought a toaster, you are actually more likely to buy another toaster. And that, because the assumption that the team had was that this was like wrong, right? That this was following you around, but they didn't know that you already bought a toaster, right? And I said, well, perhaps they do know that you've bought a toaster, and perhaps you're more likely to return it and buy another toaster. You don't know. And they said, wow, never thought about that, right? Maybe they are more likely to buy a second toaster, right? This is like, right? So I think we understand very little about these systems right now, and there are so many counterintuitive things, like this example that I just gave, which is obviously silly, but you can see my point, right? And I think that these are going to require humans in the loop for a very long time. Also, frankly, you want them for labeling. Like you know, the way we do things to get to the data point is like, I've learned over the years to not trust corporates and their data, so I just don't trust it at all. People think that there's these data lakes, right? People have been talking about the data lake for 10 years. There's a lot of lakes, there's no data in the lakes. That's the problem, right? So it's like, you know, I don't know what you're supposed to do, right? It's like, yeah, you gotta drain the data swamp or whatever, right? So I think the thing is that you've got to create it yourself. So even for us, for whether it's like the adverse media screening or the transaction screening or payment filtering, we actually contract out to the FCC compliance firms ourselves. PwC, our friends at Capgemini, all these folks, like, these are who the banks are contracting out to. We'll just label the data ourselves, right? And we'll do it in a way that's super thoughtfully curating the data to be fed into models. The data inside the corporates is largely rubbish. As you mentioned, it's all over the place. It needs to be cleaned up. It was never captured to be used for models. And you have no idea if the people that were actually clicking and doing these things were competent or paying any attention at all, right? So if we can cherry pick highly competent people, have them really be trained to properly label stuff to be fed into the machine learning models, and then now you can bootstrap a really high-performing, high-quality system. And then you can start to get the feedback going inside the bank, right? Then I'm happy to have people clicking on stuff and doing their thing and constantly training the system. So I think the way that it changes how people works, it's that it's levering folks up, right? So that the manual work that they would have needed to do to prepare to make a final decision is taken away from them, but I still want them to make the final decision, and I want them to tell me if the model was correct or if the model was incorrect, and very importantly, if the model was incorrect, I want to know why, right? Did we miss the ID match? Is this not even about this topic at all? Are these two things not connected, right? And that's the problem. I want to know what that issue is. That's going to be how I make my models better. So I think the way that you change your work is you're still doing the work, but you're not doing it of this manual gathering of stuff. You're just kind of decisioning. But then I also think there's an education and training component where you want the people to kind of understand a little bit about the system that they're interacting with. Because you do see, in many cases, profound confusion, lots of questions, and so on. So I think designing the interfaces to be intuitive and thinking about the training and education is very important, because even if it's easy for them to kind of like use the system, you want them to understand how to provide feedback to the model, because I think the way your role changes, right, where half the value you're creating has nothing at all to do with this one task. It has to do with the compounding effect of what you're doing that influences your models, right? And that's like a major mindset shift and totally different from what happens today, because you're basically saying, I want to keep, job loss, I think there will be job loss, because I think what you see is like, I want to keep my elite staff, I want the people who are paying attention, I want to do A/B tests and round robins, and I want to see who are my people that are going, always letting risk through and not really paying attention, right? And I'm catching into the line of defense. That person's not paying any attention to their job, right? So like, you don't want them there. Keep the good ones that are paying attention, and they're gonna like train the system to be better and better over time. So I do think there will be job loss, but I don't think it's about eradicating all these jobs and automating everything away. I think in all these fields where you see this rich application of machine learning and it actually works, it's gonna be this 80-20 rule where you keep the top 20% that are really clued in and doing the work, and the other ones are going to have to like find a career path where they can get serious about it. Because I think AI basically will automate away every job where people are not really into the job and it's like pretty mechanical. Then I think those are exactly the roles where there's no story for those being around.
80%, that's pretty high.
So maybe just to take maybe a less dystopian perspective on how these things could unfold, and my colleague is has more conviction that the way he anticipates the world going is confident that is in fact how it will turn out. I mean, I think we'll see, but I worked and I think soon be publishing kind of a white paper about an experiment that was done in the Financial Conduct Authority, the UK regulators, kind of innovation program, and what that involved was, a kind of reg tech, kind of machine learning, AI, and I'd say also there was an augmented intelligence component. So, with AI, people talk about artificial intelligence, but in this case, I'm going to come back to this concept of augmented intelligence, right? So, what the purpose of the experiment was, there's this massive statute in Europe, this new regulation called MiFID II, which is just this massive, sprawling, diabolical thing that was like very large and complex for financial institutions to comply with. And so these two global banks that had UK operations and tested, well, what if we have this tech ingest the regulation? Can it sort of define regulatory profiles of these entities, and then can it actually figure out what the obligations are that go with it? And in fact, some of this, and they had actually already done a lot of this work and created what they called traceability matrices. So, kind of unlike the issue that Arvind referred to, where you don't really know how to benchmark, in this particular experiment, there actually was a benchmark that had been developed independently by people who didn't realize that, it was going to be tested against something else later. They thought this big regulation was coming. And so, I think one of the, looking at what the machine did well and, what it did less well, I think what it demonstrated, so I was talking to the guys from the technology company. I said, this kind of reminds me a bit of, I started my career as a lawyer, and it's sort of like in the law firm, you've got the paralegals and you've got the associates and the partners, and the paralegals flag things where they notice, ambiguities or uncertainties, and they bring them to the associates, and then they flag them to the partners. And that really seemed to be kind of the workflow that was happening here, that they were, some things that, and maybe they were kind of the more routine things, but it wasn't like they were all there. And because you're dealing with laws, and laws are written by people, there's always interpretations, and there were things that didn't match or required interpretation, or were just some of the eccentricities of this. And so, I think, kind of the feeling of the people involved was not that, well, all the people who worked on this will be gone, but the functions that they will perform will be different, and they actually will do kind of, more interesting work, and, their understanding of the banks or the institutions and its functions will be very relevant in order to help them. But, this technology will do kind of the initial cut and surface the issues, and then these people will be more like the associates or the partners, as opposed to just out on the street, hoping that you give them a job doing something else.
So everyone gets promoted? Is that what you're saying?
I think just the nature, who knows, right? But the nature of the work that they'll be doing, some of the kind of repetitive tasks, where the machine can be trained to do it more. So I agree, that's part of the concept. But, you'll have this, I think you won't go straight from manual to, kind of artificial intelligence, but you'll have this sort of augmented intelligence where kind of man and machine work together. And I think there's going to be kind of this partnership, and I hope it lasts, all of our lifetimes at least.
Arvind, what do you think about the future of work? What % of jobs will be eliminated by AI?
Well, that's a pretty black and white question, right? So no, I think I agree with the assertion that in the short term, it's definitely going to get more interesting. The work done by humans is going to get more interesting. So just talking about the AML, context, right? Already, some of the automation that we're seeing is at the back end of AML. So, if you flag like a suspicious activity report, every time, an analyst needs to generate a narrative saying, what happened and what really transpired and why is this being flagged. So what's already happening is, AI is generating that narrative. So what was really boring and mundane, AI is doing it for you, right? So you really get to then focus on, the behavioral forensics, right? So the work is definitely getting more interesting. The mundane stuff is going to get automated. My guess, if you were to point a gun at me, I would say 30% in the short term. But, I can see it going to 80% in a couple of years because the algorithms are definitely getting better, So even when it comes to translating regulatory documents with NLP, the advances in NLP, it's only going to get better. Yeah.
But let me just to add one thing to that. So, I think also you have to kind of think about, and from the regulators as well as from society, that in a static world that might be the case. But I think you'll also have what I would consider kind of an era of rising expectations, where, as the capability of technology to assist the AML, KYC, or other important regulatory or surveillance or compliance functions occur, then there will be an expectation that the institutions are using those tools, and so the regulators' expectations will go up. And you could say, well, this is really unfair, it's moving the goalpost, but I think that's been the history, that as technology has enabled greater efficiencies. And I'll give, to me, I think one example is around kind of sampling in the case of kind of compliance and monitoring voice communications. And historically, and I've been general counsel of a firm that had a brokerage desk in my kind of earlier career, and the way we had to look to monitor behavior, whether the brokers were saying inappropriate things or encouraging or discouraging or whatever, we had to have somebody go and listen to these hours and hours of tapes. And they could have skills because you could figure out what was going on, and you could sort of match it to the time of a trade or something else. But it was kind of a manual process. And then to demonstrate that you were monitoring for something to the regulator, you'd say, well, we did sampling and we did this and we did that. But as technology has developed that allows kind of voice recognition and voice to text and some of these other techniques, and then those kind of get trained, that says, well, maybe sampling was good enough before, but maybe now that you converted voice to text and the text can be understood and you have these arcane vocabularies, then there's an expectation, oh, well, are you using the tools to try to detect these things, and maybe you do some sampling and do something else. So I think that with this kind of evolving standards, will mean that there will be plenty of work to do.
Great.
I just want to say one thing about this, because I think it's a really important thing to distinguish here the strategic long-term thing versus the short-term tactical thing. And I think an important note that you see in the wild, right, is at the end of the day, the majority of the business cases that people are writing up to buy this software are headcount reduction business cases. That's just the bottom line. And the reason why is because they're operating on top of a highly inflated headcount from this past 5-10 years of hiring binge. So I don't think it's that these jobs have kind of been sitting there and now they're going to go away. The story is actually quite a bit different. It's the job that's a hockey stick of headcount, right? And then the banks are just dying. They're just getting crushed by this. And so they all have these initiatives to try to somehow moderate this so that you could grow revenue. Even if you could just grow headcount linearly with revenue, just that would be a win, right? They can't grow headcount even it's growing super linearly with revenue, and that's toxic. It's not going to work. And so I think that the short-term tactical thing is how do we get out of this toxic cycle where headcount in compliance literally grows super linearly with revenue, because that's non-sustainable, right? And so I think we have to fix that and create a sustainable situation for the compliance ecosystem. That's the tactical thing I'm talking about, and that's you're saying, that's those 10 to 30% headcount reduction numbers that people are looking for in the near term. So that I think that's what.
That makes sense. So I have a few more questions, but let's see if people in the audience have. I know you've got one.
So Bradford and Original, and take your dystopian or utopian slice on this. so as someone who has worked on AI and machine learning for many, many years, where there was not just a single agent who was learning, but multiple agents who are learning at the same time, my question to you is this. Many of the assumptions in most of machine learning is that, oh, I'm the sophisticated one, I have the know how to run machine learning, and everybody else is pretty much static. And so then the data set comes in, to your point, and I can do slice and dice in many ways. But my question is, what happens in your view when you are not the only one sophisticated one using machine learning for AML, but the adversaries, the counterparties, all your peers are also using machine learning and AI to beat your system.
Right.
And to that point, to your earlier dystopian or utopian estimates, so I want to kind of hear your perspectives, and to the extent what your thoughts are about, not just in AML but in general, when everybody is using their AI software to game everybody else.
Right. So it's a great question. I think we mentioned earlier that I started my career in hedge funds actually first, but building the strategies and then later as a fund manager myself. And so I'm used to these adversarial, kind of domains. That's where I've spent a lot of time. So statistically what you're talking about is obviously the concept of like non-stationarity, right? So there's ways of modeling this. We've dealt with it in like financial markets for a long time. Cybersecurity is obviously another very important domain like this. So, building models on non-stationary data is something that we can do. It's harder, right, of course, but we can do it. Now, here's though, and gets to something we talked about earlier a little bit in a sort of a prep for this, like the rollout and the release process in banking is really, really adversarially aligned to the need for evolution of models because of the adversarial dynamics that you mentioned. So basically you're in this ecosystem and the bad guys are trying to get better and avoid your stuff. And then I can't change my models at all. And I can only roll them out once a year with this super elaborate like model validation thing. Whereas like in other domains, like in hedge funds or in Google or other any ad tech, right? They also have a lot of non-stationary data, and they're retraining their stuff all the time and pushing it out live all the time, right? So for me, the biggest issue in addressing the reality that you're discussing in FCC, it's not that we can't model non-stationary data, we don't know how. The problem is that we actually can't get into a release cadence that aligns to this need.
I think, those are great points, right? I think the release cadence is absolutely not at sync with, the speed at which you can innovate. I think the second interesting point, right, is you and I can have the same model, right? The same exact algorithm. But if I have more data, I'm at an advantage because my model is learning on the data, right? So I think, as every institution is now going to try and hoard more and more data, they're getting into the app business, as I mentioned earlier, so that they create more immersive experiences and they capture like more data about you through every interaction that you have. They're also looking at third-party data providers, right? So there's like a whole branch of third-party data providers just providing specialized data on individuals. So ultimately, I think data is going to win the war, right? Not just the algorithm.
Can I have another corollary to that? So what and get on here from you. So one aspect was that what I'm hearing so far is we are still focusing on the data and modeling. But perhaps there's also a meta-level perspective on thinking of the game theoretic perspective, the nonlinear dynamics. When is that going to come in? I mean, we can stay at the data level and say that, I'm going to build faster or build slower. We can do that, I understand it. Yeah. But also, we may need a bigger picture, right? What are the perhaps from a game, I'm just making that, perhaps from a game theoretic perspective, these are the key three strategies that are going on. Or from, pick your field of expertise, but using that to apply in the model building, kind of give you a holistic picture.
Well, I think that what will happen over time, which you're starting to get into there, is that the tech and legal frameworks need to come together more and evolve, together. In the most trivial example that we talked about earlier, this would be like the red flag rules for AML. So the red flag rules, if anyone's ever sat down and read them, should very obviously just be turned into code, right? And like the parts which are left fuzzy, they should just be like, we need to clarify those. There's no point to leave it like that. It should just be, something that's like codable. You start to get to the next level and you have statistical modeling, and then there the precedent, I would say, is probably like disparate impact, right? Where we think about like stats and you need to sort of like write things up from a perspective of stats. I personally think that the guidance that's been authored on this is abysmally bad, and they obviously didn't bring in any people who understand statistics, and I think it's hugely problematic. So this issue where the legal community and the statistical and modeling community need to come together to sort of forge that path forward is a serious one, and it does get into things like what you're talking about. It's like, what's the intent? What are you, if you're doing a really good job with your compliance program and you have these controls in place, what do strong controls look like? And is there a way for me to mandate strong controls in a way that's technically more savvy and evolves faster to the tech. I think we're a long ways away from figuring out how to do that, but I do agree that it's like really important coming from a perspective of a technical person. It's, you know, you always see how we're not able to think like this, right? And at the meta level. But, you know, I think we're a decade away from honestly being able to do that. I'm happy to just get like the rules right at this point. You know? Do you have a no?
Well, on that last point, you know, I guess the one part I would comment on is, you know, there is work being done to try to kind of, you know, achieve part of that vision and to kind of automate regulation in terms of so that rules and handbooks are in machine readable and machine executable code. Again, the FCA in the UK has done that with a number of sections. The CFTC, I think, will be working on that soon. Other US regulators are looking at it, and there's a lot of communication. So, you know, it kind of creates, you know, some interesting challenges based on kind of some of the work that's been done thus far. So, you know, one of them is that, you know, sometimes, you know, so these, you know, tech firms have come in and kind of looked at the language and tried to kind of, you know, tease out the meaning and sort of come up with kind of standardization and put everything into triplets and stuff so you can run with it. And so sometimes what they find is that, you know, the same word, even within, you know, kind of the same kind of body of provisions or is actually used in two slightly different meanings. And then they've got to figure out, well, which meaning is it? So how do you do that? So if you're the firm in private industry, you know, you could have your lawyers and compliance people and your tech advisors try to figure that out. And you would hope to get it right, but you might get it wrong. And then what's the consequence to you? So then the alternative is, well, what if will the regulator just tell you? So in these sort of experiments, you know, since the regulator had engaged the tech firm to sort of do this work for it, you know, they had access to regulatory feedback, so they had a greater degree of confidence that what you're getting is actually the intention. And by the way, you know, the intention of that provision, it could have been written by people who left the agency you're at 30 years ago, but it's just been consistent. So it's kind of the interpretation of the people who were working there. But, you know, if you have the interpretation of the people who were there, you know, there's some degree of confidence of that. But when you think of all the regulations in all the world, if kind of private companies are going to do this, you know, regulators typically don't want to favor one private company over another private company. So, you know, you may not be able to go and kind of get their interpretation. So then there's sort of, you're introducing an element of risk. Well, you're making an educated guess about what you think those provisions mean, but then that goes really back to the question that you put at the outset, Penny, which is, you know, can the regulators may be saying this, but can people rely on it if you don't have that absolute certainty that this regulation that's in machine readable and machine executable language, how do you know that actually reflects what the regulator intended? And these things are always judged, you know, in hindsight when something bad has happened.
Any other questions? Yeah, back here.
Can you talk about the prospect for federated learning? And by that I mean some of the, I'll say, fledgling attempts at interbank cooperation, or are we really just, do we have to resign ourselves to algorithmic learning as it applies, you know, across financial institutions?
So I think, you know, in some areas we can see scope for federated learning, even though, you know, to your point, and I think you kind of alluded to it in your question, right? There has been little success till date, right? Any federated or consortium type of effort has kind of, you know, started and stopped. Where we are seeing a little bit of traction is around, you know, KYC. So if you're going to onboard the same customer, if there is a standard way of doing, you know, KYC and, you know, really doing risk modeling around the customer, can the banks agree on it? And then once you have been onboarded in this central application, can banks start to do business with you, right? It's not, you know, it's non-differentiated. So there is more opportunity for banks to cooperate in this area. But when it comes to, you know, fraud detection or even detection of, you know, like risk modeling and stuff like that, I think we are ways away from that.
How do you do it without sharing data that you don't want your competitors to see. I think that's, and just getting these big bank with people with big egos to agree on something is always pretty hard. Sorry.
Yeah, so we've, remarkably, we've actually been able to do this already. So we learn already on data from multiple different financial institutions. And I think there's a lot of nuance to what we mean when we say federated learning and when we talk about aggregation of data and learning from multiple different data sets. So there's like a proper federated learning from like an infrastructure perspective where I literally have like a learner in 20 different financial institutions, and my learner is learning weights, and then I export those weights, and then I have some like meta learner that's doing something with those weights. And that's like really federated learning. But the reason for doing this would be that if I can't pass data out of the bank, like PII data, right? So I can only pass out weights. So then the theoretical argument is therefore I can like export these bunch of numbers, right? Not quite, because actually I have to export all the features together with the numbers, and the features are, if it's a well-designed system, will include a whole variety of different stuff then definitely legal will be concerned about, and there needs to be like a big discussion about. So it's not so simple that you just create some numbers and abstract away the PII issue. It's a little trickier than that. So I think the much more realistic thing, which is happening right away, and like literally we're doing it right now and like killing it on this, so definitely it works, is just getting data from the different institutions in a setting that's not requiring you to access like all this like mega core crown jewels data, right? So like, for example, you can run POCs and then get a bunch of data from the POC, right? And there's different data which people will export under certain circumstances. So I think that most likely we'll continue to see this story of aggregation of data outside the banks, and I'm seeing it happen honestly faster than I would have imagined. And we even had a situation in the past year where we've had many orders of magnitude more data from a new big POC client than we had from an existing production client. So, because there was much more sensitivity around exporting some of this stuff, right? And that POC data was extraordinarily valuable to increase the precision of our models in certain ways, because this financial institution had labeled a lot of really interesting stuff which wasn't in our other data set. So I see this kind of like aggregated data and learning on the aggregated data happening faster. And then I see this federated learning model, which was what I originally thought about, and we actually had this in our pitch decks and everything at some point. But I think it's trickier than it seems, and you start to get into the weeds and realize like actually it's going to take quite a lot of work, and then you start to realize, and by that I mean not necessarily the technical work, but really like the legal compliance and the buy-in and all this stuff, right? The diplomatic work is really the beast here. And in the end, you got to ask yourself, what are we getting? You know, if we can assemble this kind of like golden data set on the outside, like Stephen, my partner in crime, was one of the early execs at Montas, and they've had built a golden data set outside the banks at Montas for quite a long time ago. And so I think this is an established precedent. You can do this. You can get data out of the financial institutions. Again, you have the luxury that now I can hire all these different FCC firms, like all the big four folks and so on. I can bring them in. I can have them label data. So my suspicion is that we move to a world of more aggregated data, even with some PII information outside the banks, and that the federating learning stuff is going to be like maybe a pipe dream, which is like totally different than what I would have told you 3 years ago.
All right. Maybe we have time for one or two more. Any other questions? Yeah, one back here.
How do you face the challenge dual challenges of selling into a cost center? Right, it's not something that like the leadership of the bank is necessarily super excited about, and a lot of your pitch must be, we'll save you X amount of dollars down the line, kind of preventative medicine, and that's just a difficult psychological challenge, I think, for humans to wrestle with. And then also the challenge of how much more does this demonstrate to regulators that you're really trying, right? Like there's kind of a narrative around, we spend X amount of dollars. I worked on a couple years back now a value of risk system that had been broken for months at a time at a multi-billion-dollar trading desk, and basically people didn't care, right? Like they cared, but it wasn't a big rush. And so how do you face the challenge of that narrative that gets sold to the regulators versus actually implementing that work and making a change in their systems?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when you go after a business like this kind of a space, timing is everything, and you have to have a massive, massive stack of catalysts, right? So we were very, very thoughtful and deliberate about how we chose this business. Like, it wasn't a random thing that I thought was a good idea or something. Like, I have a whole finance team that works with me on venture selection, and like, this is a pretty gnarly process. So listen, everybody is buying this stuff left and right. Like, every bank CEO has some kind of initiative in their top 3 KPIs for fixing AML. Like, it's one of the biggest problems in the entire industry. The spend is crazy. Like, I mean, Jamie had a reimagined KYC thing last year, like, as one of his top 3 things in the whole JP Morgan Chase, right? So, no, this is a big deal. People have to fix this immediately. The fines are crazy. The cost is spiraling out of control. And that's exactly why this is an amazing business right now. Because of what you said, you have this historically very difficult market to penetrate, and it is a cost center, and it is very unsexy, and people don't want to spend money on it from the executive level, right? Because it's not making them win. But when everybody's getting fined billions of dollars, and your headcount is escalating out of control, and your big bank spending $2-3 billion on compliance annually, then you start to be like, yo, like, this is out of control, right? And so I think we've reached the point where it's literally broken the back of the global banking system. And they can't innovate either. Like, if you go around in these banks, nobody will do anything new. And the reason is mostly compliance, right? It's so hard for them to do, like, digital innovation, for example. And so I think they realize this, like, the stack of catalysts, whether it's the cost, the headcount, the risk and the fines, or the inability to innovate, it just piled up to the point where if you talk to any CEO of the top 50 banks, they will definitely tell you this is one of their top few problems. So that's the reality of the space right now. It's like that serious, right? It's like a CEO issue now. And so I think that's where we're at and why people are adopting and making decisions quickly. But it's not a window that's open forever, right? Like, industries ebb and flow, and you see these kind of like deep core problems where people have to fix it in a mad rush for 5 years or so. And these are few and far between when you have one of these magical moments of rapid adoption and transformation. That's exactly what we're seeing right now in the FCC space. I think if we had started this business 6 years ago, we would already be dead, right? But instead, we're killing it, right? And it's just timing, you know? Yeah, I had one of my best mentor ever told me, some people are lucky and they're born smart, and other people are much smarter and they're born lucky, right? So you want to be in the latter camp.
All right, excellent. Well, on that note, I think we're out of time. I'd like to thank our panel, Bradford, Jeff, and Arindam. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming. You've been a really great group, and I think it's been really fun. Thank you.